Miss Marple and the Parish Council election. Welcome to Mindful Musings. I'm your host, William, and I'm delighted you've joined us today. Before we begin this intriguing tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Share your location in the comments below. I read every single one and truly enjoy seeing how far our stories travel. Now, settle into your favourite chair with a warm cup of tea and let us journey together into the mysteries that unfold in the quiet village of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 1. The evening before the vote. The October evening had settled over St. Mary Mead with a peculiar heaviness that Miss Jane Marple found distinctly unsettling. She made her way along the high street toward the village hall, her walking stick tapping a steady rhythm against the pavement, while golden leaves swirled about her sensible shoes. The village hall stood illuminated against the darkening sky, every window blazing with light. Inside, the hall buzzed with barely suppressed energy. Folding chairs had been arranged in neat rows facing a makeshift stage where two lecterns stood like opposing sentinels. Mrs. Dolly Bantry waved from across the room, beckoning Miss Marple to join her in the third row. As she settled into her seat, Dolly leaned close, her voice lowered to a conspiratorial whisper. "Have you ever seen anything like it, Jane? Half the village hasn't spoken to the other half in weeks." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles, surveying the divided crowd. On the left sat the older residents in their Sunday best. On the right congregated the younger families, some holding babies. At 7 o'clock, Mrs. Constance Hartwell made her entrance. She was a formidable woman in her late 60s, dressed in a severe navy suit. Behind her came Mr. James Pemberton, perhaps 40, in a modern suit that managed to appear both professional and approachable. Mrs. Hartwell spoke first of stability, tradition, and proven leadership. Mr. Pemberton countered with internet connectivity, affordable housing, and transparent governance. The question period began civilly but grew increasingly sharp. It was during the final question that the incident occurred. A young mother asked about plans for a community centre with childcare facilities. As Mrs. Hartwell began her response, the microphone emitted a strange buzzing sound. Then, without warning, a brilliant blue spark arced from the microphone stand. The lights flickered, dimmed, and surged back to full brightness. Mrs. Hartwell stumbled backward, her hand jerking away from the lectern. For a moment she looked genuinely shaken. "I'm quite all right," she insisted, though her voice trembled. "Just a minor electrical fault." The debate concluded without further incident. As people filed out, Miss Marple overheard fragments of conversation about the electrical fault. She walked home slowly, troubled by something she couldn't quite name. The electrical fault had seemed almost deliberate. She had no way of knowing that by morning the election would be the least of St. Mary Mead's concerns. Chapter 2. A Kettle Most Lethal. The October morning dawned clear and crisp. Miss Marple had just settled down with her tea when the telephone rang. The urgency of its tone sent a shiver of apprehension through her. "Miss Marple!" De Haydock's voice carried unmistakable distress. "I must ask you to come to Rose Cottage immediately. There's been a death. Mrs. Hartwell." Rose Cottage sat at the far end of the high street. Mrs. Hartwell's housekeeper, Agnes Pearce, opened the door, her eyes red from weeping. "I found her this morning when I came to prepare breakfast. She was lying in the kitchen, and the kettle was still steaming on the floor beside her." Dr. Haydock appeared in the hallway. "Inspector Slack is in the kitchen. I think you'll want to see this." Mrs. Hartwell lay on the kitchen floor, her body positioned as though she'd simply collapsed. Near her right hand, an electric kettle lay on its side, water spread beneath it. "Appears she was electrocuted by a faulty kettle," Inspector Slack said. "Dr. Haydock confirms electrical burns consistent with contact with live current." Miss Marple approached carefully, studying the kettle without touching it. Something about the base troubled her. "Inspector, I suggest having a qualified electrician examine this kettle very carefully. I believe it's been tampered with." Inspector Slack's eyebrows rose. "Tampered with?" Miss Marple pointed with her walking stick. "The metal contacts appear modified. The discoloration suggests recent soldering work, and the screws, their heads are scratched, indicating they've been recently removed and replaced." Dr. Haydock crouched beside her. "By George, you're right." "Given last night's electrical incident at the debate," Miss Marple said carefully, "I find the timing remarkable." Agnes Pearce spoke from the doorway. Mrs. Hartwell mentioned feeling a small tingle yesterday when she first plugged in the kettle, around 4 o'clock. Her nephew Edward was here in the afternoon. He's an electrician and often stops by to check on things. Miss Marple and Inspector Slack exchanged meaningful glances. This wasn't a crime of passion, Miss Marple observed quietly. This was premeditated murder requiring technical knowledge and careful planning. Inspector Slack moved toward the door. "I'll need to speak with Edward Finch immediately." "Inspector," Miss Marple added, "you might also examine the electrical system at the village hall. Last night's power surge may not have been accidental." As the inspector departed, Miss Marple remained, studying the scene with methodical patience. Someone had ensured Mrs. Hartwell's last morning would be her final one. Chapter 3. The Nephew with Electrical Expertise. By afternoon, news of Mrs. Hartwell's death had spread through St. Mary Mead with remarkable speed. The polling station remained closed by Inspector Slack's order. Voters, expecting to cast ballots, found instead a notice announcing the election's postponement pending investigation. Miss Marple had taken up her position in her garden, ostensibly tending late-season roses, but actually observing the comings and goings along the high street. Mrs. Bantry appeared at the garden gate, slightly breathless. "Jane, have you heard? They've taken Edward Finch in for questioning. The whole village is buzzing." Miss Marple set down her secateurs and invited Dolly to the garden bench. "What do you know of Edward Finch?" Mrs. Bantry settled onto the bench. "He's been the village electrician for 7 or 8 years, took over his father's business. He's done work for practically everyone. Very professional, very thorough. And his relationship with his aunt? Complicated. Edward's mother died when he was young. Mrs. Hartwell helped raise him, paid for his training. They were close for years, then had some falling out about 3 years ago. Only recently had they begun speaking again." "When Edward did work at your house, did you notice anything particular about his methods?" Mrs. Bantry considered carefully. "Now that you mention it, yes. He was extraordinarily meticulous, made notes about everything, took photographs, kept detailed records. He even provided us with a binder containing wiring diagrams and maintenance schedules." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Detailed records. How interesting." That evening, Inspector Slack telephoned. His voice carried frustration. The kettle was definitely tampered with, modified to deliver a lethal shock. The work was professional, done by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. And Mr. Finch? He admits to being at Rose Cottage yesterday afternoon. Says he was checking circuit breakers in the basement. Claims he never went into the kitchen. Problem is, we can't prove otherwise. "Has the village hall's electrical system been examined?" "Yes, and Miss Marple, you were right. Someone had tampered with the microphone wiring. It was set up to create that power surge deliberately. Our expert says it was meant to test whether the system modifications would work without causing permanent damage." Miss Marple absorbed this information. "So someone was practicing?" "Precisely. Testing their modification before using it to kill Mrs. Hartwell." "Inspector, I wonder if you've looked into Mrs. Hartwell's council records, her financial dealings, particularly regarding permits and fees?" There was a pause. "What makes you ask that?" "Just a thought. Good evening, Inspector." Miss Marple set down the receiver, her mind working methodically through the emerging pattern. Chapter 4. Secrets in the Council Files. The following morning, Miss Marple paid a visit to the vicarage, where her friend Miss Abernathy served as the Parish Council Secretary. The vicarage study was cluttered with filing boxes and ledgers testament to decades of village administration. "Miss Marple, how lovely to see you," Miss Abernathy said, though her smile was strained. "Dreadful business about Mrs. Hartwell. I still can't quite believe it." "Indeed. I wonder, dear, if you might help me understand something about council procedures, specifically regarding permit fees and applications." Miss Abernathy's expression grew troubled. "What sort of thing did you want to know?" "Well, I've been thinking about young couples who've applied for building permits. The Hendersons, for instance, who wanted to extend their cottage for their growing family. Or the Mitchells, who wished to convert their garage. Both were refused, weren't they?" "Yes, Mrs. Hartwell felt the applications didn't meet proper standards." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And both families paid rather substantial application fees, did they not?" Miss Abernathy shifted uncomfortably. "The council sets the fee schedule. Mrs. Hartwell always said administrative costs must be covered." Quite so, but I noticed that official council fee schedules, the ones published in the parish newsletter, show considerably lower amounts than what families actually paid. The Hendersons mentioned paying £300. The published fee was £80. Miss Abernathy's face had gone pale. I don't know anything about that. Of course you don't, dear, but someone does. Someone who's been collecting the difference between official fees and actual charges. Someone who's been doing so for quite some time. Miss Marple spoke gently, but her eyes were sharp. I suspect if one were to examine Mrs. Hartwell's personal financial records and compare them to official council accounts, one might find interesting discrepancies. You're suggesting Mrs. Hartwell was stealing from villagers? I'm suggesting she was collecting unauthorized fees. Whether she kept the money or used it for other purposes remains to be seen. Miss Abernathy sat heavily in her chair. If what you're suggesting is true, it would be devastating. Mrs. Hartwell has been council chair for 20 years. Exactly. 20 years of these enhanced fees would amount to a considerable sum. And if someone discovered this irregularity, Mrs. Hartwell might face criminal charges. But who would know? The records are kept confidential. Someone with access to her home office, Miss Marple suggested quietly. Someone who might have been working on electrical wiring in that very office. Someone who might have seen financial documents while ostensibly checking power outlets. Understanding dawned on Miss Abernathy's face. Edward Finch. It's merely speculation, Miss Marple cautioned, but it would explain their recent reconciliation. Perhaps Edward discovered the irregularities and confronted his aunt. Perhaps they reached some arrangement. Or perhaps he decided to solve the problem permanently, Miss Abernathy whispered. Miss Marple rose from her chair. That, my dear, is what we must determine. Chapter 5. The Modified Wiring Diagram. Inspector Slack stood in Mrs. Hartwell's home office, examining the room with new understanding. The filing cabinets, the desk drawers, the computer, all potentially contained evidence of years of financial impropriety. Miss Marple had telephoned him that morning with her theory, and he had obtained a warrant immediately. Miss Marple herself stood by the window, watching as the inspector's team carefully documented everything. Her attention, however, was focused on something else entirely, the electrical work Edward Finch had recently completed in this very room. Inspector, might I direct your attention to the outlet installation behind the desk? Inspector Slack joined her. What about it? Notice how the wall plate has been removed and replaced. The screw heads show fresh scratching, identical to the marks we observed on the kettle's base plate. This is Edward Finch's work. I recognize his distinctive pattern. The inspector leaned closer. I see what you mean. More importantly, this outlet is positioned directly above the desk's filing drawer. Anyone installing it would need to remove files temporarily. They would have ample opportunity to examine documents while working. Miss Marple opened the desk drawer, revealing meticulously organized files. One folder was labeled Applications Pending Review. She withdrew it carefully, using a handkerchief to avoid leaving fingerprints. Inside were dozens of application forms, each showing the official council fee printed at the bottom. Stapled to each application was a receipt for a much larger amount, handwritten on Mrs. Hartwell's personal stationery. Good Lord, Inspector Slack breathed. You were right. She's been overcharging by hundreds of pounds per application. And if one examines the dates, Miss Marple pointed out, this practice extends back at least 15 years, possibly longer. The inspector calculated quickly. That's easily £200,000, maybe more. Indeed, a substantial sum that would be forfeit if Mrs. Hartwell's impropriety became public. Criminal charges would be virtually certain. Inspector Slack began photographing the evidence. So Edward Finch discovers his aunt's corruption while doing electrical work. What then? Blackmail? Partnership? Or perhaps something more complex, Miss Marple suggested. Notice these electrical diagrams. She'd found a folder containing detailed wiring schematics for Rose Cottage, all drawn in Edward's precise hand. The diagrams showed every circuit, every outlet, every electrical connection in the house. One page, however, caught her attention. This diagram shows the kitchen wiring. It's dated 2 weeks ago. But look here, there's a notation about the kettle circuit being isolated for modification. The note is in Edward's handwriting. Inspector Slack's expression darkened. He was planning this for weeks. It appears so, which raises an interesting question. Why wait until the night before the election? Chapter 6. The Business Records Revelation. While Inspector Slack continued examining Mrs. Hartwell's council files, Miss Marple requested permission to visit Edward Finch's business premises. The inspector, recognizing the value of her observational skills, agreed, sending Sergeant Lake to accompany her. Finch's electrical services occupied a modest storefront on the edge of St. Mary Mead. The front office was tidy, with a reception desk and filing cabinets lining the walls. Sergeant Lake used his authority to access the premises, and Miss Marple began her examination. "What exactly are we looking for?" the sergeant asked. "Patterns, dear boy. Patterns and records." She opened the filing cabinet marked Residential Work 2023 and began methodically reviewing job sheets. Each one was indeed meticulously documented, just as Mrs. Bantry had described. Photographs, wiring diagrams, materials lists, time logs, everything precisely recorded. She found the file for Rose Cottage. The work history was extensive, dozens of jobs over the past 8 weeks, each carefully documented. But something caught her attention. The billing records showed amounts that didn't match the work described. "Sergeant, look at this. Edward billed his aunt £3,000 for electrical safety upgrades 6 weeks ago, but the actual work described, replacing a few outlets and checking breakers, would cost perhaps £500 at most." Sergeant Lake examined the records. Perhaps there was additional work not documented. Or perhaps, Miss Marple said quietly, Mrs. Hartwell was paying her nephew for something other than electrical work. She continued searching, finding more files, more invoices, more discrepancies. Then, in the filing cabinet marked Accounts Private, she discovered something extraordinary. A ledger book, handwritten, showing regular payments from C.H., undoubtedly Constance Hartwell, to Edward Finch. The amounts varied, but they occurred monthly, going back 2 years. The total exceeded £50,000. "This isn't payment for electrical work," Miss Marple observed. "This is something else entirely." Sergeant Lake looked confused. Blackmail? Possibly. Or perhaps the opposite. Perhaps Mrs. Hartwell was paying Edward to remain silent about what he'd discovered. A partnership of sorts. She turned pages carefully, noting dates and amounts. Then she noticed something peculiar. 3 weeks ago the payments stopped. The final entry read, "C.H. Final payment. Project termination." "Project termination," Miss Marple murmured. 3 weeks before the election. 3 weeks before Mrs. Hartwell's death. What does it mean? I suspect it means Mrs. Hartwell decided to end whatever arrangement she'd made with her nephew. Perhaps she planned to confess, to resign after the election. Perhaps she'd grown tired of paying him. Miss Marple closed the ledger thoughtfully. Which would give Edward Finch a powerful motive for murder, not to prevent exposure of his aunt's corruption, but to prevent exposure of his own involvement in it. She collected the ledger and several other documents. "We must show these to Inspector Slack immediately." Chapter 7. The Component Purchase Records. Inspector Slack spread the documents across his desk at the police station. Edward Finch's business records told a disturbing story, not just of a nephew who'd discovered his aunt's corruption, but of one who'd been profiting from it for 2 years before deciding murder was his best option. "We've confirmed the payments," Inspector Slack reported. "Mrs. Hartwell's bank records show regular transfers to Edward's business account, totaling exactly what your ledger indicates. £53,000 over 24 months, Miss Marple nodded. "And the final payment notation? Made 3 weeks ago, as you noted. Mrs. Hartwell withdrew £10,000 in cash and noted it as final settlement in her personal accounts. So she was ending their arrangement. Apparently, but that's not all we've discovered." Inspector Slack produced another file. "We've examined Edward's business purchases from electrical supply companies. 3 weeks ago, he ordered several specialized components, high-voltage capacitors, modified contact switches, and heavy-duty wiring specifically rated for mains current applications." Miss Marple's expression sharpened. "Components that would serve no purpose in normal residential electrical work." "Exactly, but they're precisely what would be needed to modify a household kettle into a lethal device. Our electrical expert confirmed it. These components, when properly installed, could bypass all safety features and deliver a full mains current shock." 3 weeks ago, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully, The same time Mrs. Hartwell made her final payment and ended their arrangement. He began planning the murder the moment she cut him off. Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the village. Not quite, Inspector. I suspect he began planning it when he realized she intended to confess. The end of payments was merely confirmation that she'd made her decision. How do you know she intended to confess? I don't know with certainty, but consider the timing. Mrs. Hartwell had been council chair for 20 years, collecting illegal fees throughout that time. This election was particularly contentious, with Mr. Pemberton pushing for transparency and modern governance. She was nearly 70 years old and had recently seemed troubled. Miss Marple turned from the window. I believe she'd decided this would be her final term. She would win the election, serve one more year, then resign and confess to her irregularities. She'd face consequences, yes, but she'd also clear her conscience. And Edward realized that her confession would expose him as well. Precisely. Even if she kept his name out of her confession, investigators would discover the payments. They'd question where the money went. Edward's business would be examined. His involvement would become clear. Inspector Slack absorbed this logic. So he killed her before she could confess, making it look like an accident, ensuring her corruption stayed hidden forever. And ensuring his own involvement remained secret. Had Mrs. Hartwell died of apparent accidental electrocution, no one would have examined her finances. Edward would have been safe. Except you noticed the modified kettle, the inspector said, with grudging admiration. Chapter 8. The Debate Hall Discovery. Miss Marple had requested one final examination of the village hall's electrical system. Inspector Slack's expert had already confirmed the microphone tampering, but Miss Marple wanted to see the installation herself. Sometimes, she'd learned, understanding how something was done revealed why it was done. The village hall caretaker, Mr. Griggs, accompanied them to the small electrical room behind the stage. The space was cramped, filled with breaker panels and wiring conduits. The microphone system runs through here, Mr. Griggs explained, pointing to a junction box. Simple setup. 3 microphones on stage, all connected to the main amplifier. Miss Marple examined the junction box carefully. The cover showed fresh tool marks where it had been recently opened. Inside, someone had made modifications to the wiring, adding extra connections that served no apparent purpose in a normal sound system. Inspector, look at these connections. Do you see how they're wired? Inspector Slack leaned in. I'm no electrician, but they seem unnecessarily complex. Indeed, our expert noted that these modifications were designed to create a controlled power surge, something dramatic enough to be noticed, but not dangerous enough to cause serious injury. It was, as we suspected, a test. But a test of what? Miss Marple pointed to a specific wire. This connection would have allowed someone to trigger the surge remotely from backstage. They could control exactly when it occurred during the debate. She stepped back, considering the implications. Edward needed to know his electrical modifications would work as planned. He couldn't risk the kettle failing to deliver a lethal shock, or failing in some unexpected way that would immediately suggest tampering. So he created a similar modification here, in a public setting, to test the concept. But the microphone surge didn't kill anyone. Of course not. It was calibrated to be safe, alarming, but harmless. If it had failed completely, if the surge hadn't occurred at all, Edward would have known his design was flawed. He'd have had time to reconsider his plan before installing the lethal version in his aunt's kettle. Inspector Slack's eyes widened, and when the surge worked exactly as he'd designed it, he knew the kettle modification would work too. Precisely. The debate was his final rehearsal, his confirmation that he could control the timing and effect of an electrical shock. The next morning, he allowed his aunt to complete the circuit herself, simply by making her morning tea. Mr. Griggs had been listening with growing horror. You mean Edward Finch deliberately caused that power surge? I thought it was just old wiring. I'm afraid it was rather more sinister than that, Miss Marple said gently. They returned to the main hall where morning sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the space where Mrs. Hartwell had given her final speech. Miss Marple stood near the lectern, remembering the moment of the surge. Inspector, there's one more thing. During the debate, I noticed someone watching the stage very intently during the power surge. A young man near the back, perhaps in his 30s, studying everything with unusual focus. Edward Finch? I didn't recognize him at the time, but yes, I believe it was. He would have wanted to observe the results of his test. Chapter 9, The Hidden Embezzlement Trail. The final piece of the puzzle emerged when Inspector Slack's financial investigators completed their analysis of both Mrs. Hartwell's and Edward Finch's accounts. The inspector summoned Miss Marple to the police station to review their findings. Miss Marple, this case has become considerably more complex than we initially imagined. Inspector Slack spread bank statements across his desk. Mrs. Hartwell collected approximately £200,000 in unauthorised fees over 20 years. We've confirmed that through comparison of official council fee schedules and actual receipts. Yes, we'd established that. But here's what's interesting. In the past 2 years, approximately £50,000 mysteriously disappeared from her accounts, withdrawn in cash or transferred to untraceable accounts. At first, we assumed these were the payments to Edward. But they weren't. They were, but there's more. Edward received £53,000 from his aunt over 2 years, as we documented. However, his business expenses and personal spending exceed his legitimate income by approximately £100,000 during the same period. Miss Marple's sharp eyes studied the statements. You're suggesting Edward had another source of income? We're suggesting Edward was stealing from his aunt's theft operation. Look at these entries in Mrs. Hartwell's records. Payments marked received that show different amounts in Edward's ledger. The difference is always in Edward's favour. Inspector Slack pointed to specific transactions. Here, Mrs. Hartwell notes receiving £500 from the Henderson application. Edward's ledger shows her paying him £700 for electrical consultation. He inflated the amounts, keeping the difference. Embezzlement from embezzlement, Miss Marple said quietly. Exactly. Over 2 years, he skimmed approximately £50,000 beyond what his aunt was knowingly paying him. He was stealing from a thief, and she hadn't noticed. Until recently, the inspector nodded grimly. We found a note in Mrs. Hartwell's effects, dated 2 weeks before her death. It reads, E. Discrepancies in accounts. Must discuss immediately. She'd discovered his theft. Miss Marple absorbed this information. So, Edward's motive wasn't simply preventing his aunt's confession from exposing their arrangement. It was preventing her from exposing his theft from her illegal operation. A theft she couldn't report without incriminating herself. Which is precisely why he thought he'd be safe. Mrs. Hartwell couldn't go to the police about the missing money without admitting where the money came from. She was trapped by her own corruption. Until she decided to confess everything. Miss Marple nodded slowly. When she made that decision, Edward's comfortable arrangement collapsed. Her confession would reveal not only her illegal fees, but also his theft of those fees. He'd be prosecuted not just as her accomplice, but as someone who'd stolen from the stolen money. So he killed her before she could confess. Making it appear accidental, preserving her reputation as a devoted public servant, and ensuring his own crimes stayed buried forever. Inspector Slack gathered the statements. We have enough to charge him with murder, theft, and conspiracy. The evidence is overwhelming. What will you tell the village? Miss Marple asked quietly. The truth. They deserve to know. Chapter 10. Justice and its Complications. The arrest of Edward Finch sent shockwaves through St. Mary Mead. The revelation that Mrs. Hartwell had been systematically overcharging villagers for 20 years, and that her own nephew had been stealing from her theft operation before murdering her, strained the villagers' capacity for comprehension. Miss Marple sat in her garden 3 days after Edward's arrest, entertaining Mrs. Bantry and several other ladies who'd come seeking her insight into the tragedy. I still can't quite grasp it all, Mrs. Bantry confessed. Mrs. Hartwell was corrupt, Edward was corrupt, and somehow that corruption created conditions for murder. Corruption often does, Miss Marple observed. When people build their lives on dishonesty, they become trapped by it. Mrs. Hartwell couldn't report Edward's theft without exposing her own crimes. Edward couldn't allow her confession without facing prosecution himself. Miss Abernathy, who'd joined them, looked troubled. What happens now with the council? Do we invalidate all decisions Mrs. Hartwell made over 20 years? I believe the council solicitor is addressing that question, Miss Marple replied. But consider this. Most of her decisions, while influenced by personal interest, weren't necessarily wrong on their merits. The challenge is determining which decisions were corrupt and which were simply conservative governance. "And the money?" Mrs. Bantry asked. "The illegal fees people paid?" "Inspector Slack has indicated the Crown will attempt to recover Mrs. Hartwell's estate to provide restitution. However, given Edward's theft of much of that money, full repayment is unlikely." The ladies sat in troubled silence, contemplating the implications. "What I find most troubling," Miss Abernathy said finally, "is that we all enabled this. We paid the fees without questioning them. We accepted Mrs. Hartwell's authority without demanding accountability. We created the conditions that allowed her corruption to flourish." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "That, my dear, is the most important insight. Corruption doesn't occur in isolation. It requires complicity, or at minimum, complacency from those who should be vigilant." "What about Mr. Pemberton?" Mrs. Bantry asked. "Will he become council chair by default?" "The election has been rescheduled for next month. Mr. Pemberton will stand unopposed, though he's indicated he'll implement immediate reforms. Transparent financial reporting, term limits and regular audits." "Should have been done years ago," Miss Abernathy muttered. As the ladies departed, Miss Marple remained in her garden, reflecting on the case's moral complexities. Edward Finch would face trial for murder, theft and conspiracy. His defence would likely argue that Mrs. Hartwell's corruption had created impossible circumstances, that he'd been trapped by her crimes. But Miss Marple knew the truth was simpler and more damning. Edward hadn't been trapped by his aunt's corruption. He'd exploited it. He hadn't killed to prevent exposure of her crimes, but to prevent exposure of his own. His theft from stolen money demonstrated not desperation, but calculated opportunism. The evening sun cast long shadows across her garden as Inspector Slack arrived for a final consultation. "The Crown Prosecution Service is confident of conviction," he reported. "Edward's purchased components, the wiring modifications, the financial records, all the evidence points to premeditated murder." "Yes, I rather thought it would." "There is one thing that troubles me," the inspector admitted. "Edward claims his aunt had told him she planned to confess after winning the election. He says he was simply preventing her from destroying both their lives, that he acted to protect them both." Miss Marple considered this. "And do you believe him?" "I believe he's convinced himself it's true. That's what makes this case so troubling. He genuinely seems to think he was justified, that his aunt's decision to confess was selfish, that she wasn't considering how it would affect him." "The moral blindness of the corrupt," Miss Marple observed. "They can never quite see that their own choices created their predicament. Edward wanted the benefits of his aunt's corruption, the money he embezzled, without accepting responsibility for participating in it." Inspector Slack nodded. "The village is struggling with these questions. Several people have told me they feel guilty for not questioning Mrs. Hartwell's fees earlier. They wonder if they're somehow responsible for what happened. They bear responsibility for complacency, not for murder. Those are quite different things." As the inspector took his leave, Miss Marple returned to her contemplation of the garden. St. Mary Mead would recover, as villagers always did. The election would proceed, reforms would be implemented, and eventually the scandal would fade into local history. But the lessons remained. Corruption, left unchecked, created conditions for worse corruption. Dishonesty built structures that trapped those who practiced it. And murder, in the end, was simply the final desperate act of someone who'd built their life on lies and couldn't bear to see them exposed. The autumn evening settled gently over St. Mary Mead, bringing with it the promise of change, accountability, and perhaps in time, redemption.